When we think the American Revolution and America's first hero, we usually think George Washington. Though Washington was our first president and commander-in-chief of American forces during the American Revolution, he didn't win the war for independence by himself. Washington was not the greatest military commander the world had ever saw. His military career was checkered at best. American defeat was imminent on several occasions under his command, and he lost more battles than he ever won. But what Washington was good at was surrounding himself with information by listening to trusted people around him. One of those people was Hugh Mercer. Dr. Hugh Mercer was destined to lead and fight. His military career was astounding, and his good friend named George Washington knew it and trusted Mercer enough to suggest his presence among his ranks. Fighting for a just cause, the doctor became a brigadier general. He spawned the idea of Washington's famous Delaware River crossing and commanded troops in the famous turning point of the war for America's independence at Trenton and Princeton. Yet in America, hardly anyone is taught who he is. It's time to fill in that gap. This is the story of the Scottish rebel, a Pennsylvania frontier doctor, a military commander, and brigadier general in the American Revolution. This is the story of Hugh Mercer. On January 16, 1726, Hugh Mercer was born in Aberdeenshire, Scotland, to William Mercer, a Presbyterian minister, and Anne Monroe. At age 15, Hugh Mercer enrolled in the University of Aberdeen to study medicine. He graduated a full-fledged physician in 1744 at the age of 19. At the time, Scotland and Britain were at odds over the throne. In 1688, King James II, who was Catholic, was removed from the English throne and replaced by William of Orange, who was Protestant. This subject was covered briefly in my videos on the Mason and Dixon line. Scotland, which was mostly Catholic, sided with King James's Stuart family, while Britain sided with the Protestant Hanover family. The Hanover family is the same family of King George III, who America declared independence from, and the family of the British monarchy today. The loyalists to the House of Stuart in the Scottish Highlands became known as the Jacobites and offered aid to the Stuarts as they tried to regain the throne of England, but none were very successful. In 1745, however, Charles Edward Stuart, grandson of James II, arrived on the shores of Scotland, ready to rally the Scottish Highlanders to rebel against Britain, and young Hugh Mercer joined their ranks as an assistant surgeon. On April 16, 1746, the Jacobite forces commanded by Charles Edward Stuart met head-to-head with British troops commanded by the Duke of Cumberland, the younger brother of King George II, who at the time was the King of England. These two forces met on Culloden Moor in Scotland, and the battle commenced. Straight from an Outlander book or an Outlander TV series, the Scottish Highlanders charged the British lines, sustaining heavy casualties from cannon fire and musket fire. Once the Highlanders slowly crossed the muddy moor created by rain and sleet that morning, they assaulted the British line, only to have their shields meet the point of bayonets. Young Hugh Mercer most likely treated many bayonet wounds, and many of these wounds were under the arm, slicing the artery, which was hard to treat and became fatal to many Highlanders. The Highlanders' line broke, and the Jacobite rebellion was routed at this bloody battle. The British were victorious. The Duke of Cumberland ordered no quarters to anyone present at the Battle of Culloden, denoting them as mere traitors. Even non-combatants were to be shown no mercy, and this included Dr. Hugh Mercer, who was a surgeon at the battle for the Jacobites. As the British government swept the Highlands for traitors and Jacobite sympathizers, capturing many and stealing their livestock, Hugh Mercer went into hiding. On March 1747, Dr. Mercer hitched a ride from Aberdeen to Lemth on board a fisherman's boat, following the example of his Jacobite leader, Charles Edward Stuart, who happened to flee to France after his defeat. Dr. Mercer also planned to leave the country as well. He boarded a ship to the New World at Edinburgh and arrived in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania later that year. Upon arriving in Philadelphia, the young doctor sought a community that was less alien to him as Philadelphia was. He wanted to be with his own people, the Scots. This was most likely because he felt he was a wanted man with the British Empire. He packed up what he had and moved to the Pennsylvania frontier, which at the time was the Cumberland Valley, now located in south-central Pennsylvania today. This area was heavily populated with his fellow Scots and Scotch-Irish immigrants. He settled down between Antrim, which is modern-day Greencastle area today, and Black's Trading Post, which is modern-day Mercersburg, Pennsylvania, in this house behind me here. This is all that is left of the structure that once was residence of Dr. Hugh Mercer on the Pennsylvania frontier. It was owned by John McClellan at the time, and the farm he resided on was called Avonborough. While here on the frontier, Dr. Mercer was served his community and his profession, treating broken bones, illnesses, and diseases, while mixing concoctions to create medicine from his surroundings out here to heal people's ailments. All this while hiding in plain sight from the very empire that said they would execute him for treason. As time passed in Mercer's frontier community, which was known as the Conagajig Settlement, named after this creek right here behind me, the Conagajig Creek. This is actually the mouth of the Conagajig Creek in Williamsport, Maryland. But while he passed time here in this frontier community, hostilities were escalating between the relationship of French forces in the interior of North America and the English military along its coast. The French allied themselves with Native American tribes in the west and built forts in modern-day western Pennsylvania to defend against the English might in the east. A more detailed description of these events can be found in my video entitled The Capture of James Smith and the Start of the French and Indian War, if you want more information, of course. The gist of the story is George Washington was sent to inform the French that they should leave what was felt to be English-owned land. The French refused, eventually leading to Washington's defeat and surrender at Fort Necessity on July 4th, 1754. In response, the Duke of Cumberland, who defeated the Jacobites at Culloden and hunted Dr. Hugh Mercer, chose General Edward Braddock to lead an expedition into the interior to remove the French from their main fort in modern-day Pittsburgh, which is called Fort Duquesne. On July 9, 1755, Braddock's force, accompanied by a young George Washington, was ambushed by a much smaller French and Indian force that resulted in a catastrophic defeat of Braddock and his British troops. Braddock and his second-in-command were both killed in the battle, leaving George Washington to lead the retreat back to camp when the third-in-command, whose name was Colonel Thomas Dunbar, took control and retreat to Fort Cumberland in modern-day Cumberland, Maryland today. Hearing of the number of English wounded at Fort Cumberland, Dr. Mercer made the trek from his Conagajig settlement to the fort in Maryland to help treat the sick and the wounded. With the French and Indians emboldened from their victory and the lack of military and militia forces established by the province of Pennsylvania's Quaker government, many on the frontier felt that Dunbar should send the sick and the wounded to Philadelphia and camp the remainder of his force near the Conagajig settlement to defend it from possible Indian and French attack. Mercer most likely agreed with this observation and opinion. But Dunbar decided to retire his entire force to Philadelphia to set up camp for the winter in August, leaving Mercer's community vulnerable to Indian attack. Indian war parties began raiding the Great Cove west of the Conococheague settlement later in the year of 1755, resulting in destruction of farms, killing of livestock, murder of innocent civilians, and capture of many women and children. That violence eventually spilled over into Mercer's community with the same murderous results. Dr. Mercer was now busy treating war wounds as his native Scottish peoples faced a formidable enemy of forest fighters descending on their community from the west. For more information on this time period, please watch my 3-part series called 8 Days of Hell and the first part of my video called Murder in the Paxton Boys. As the Scotch-Irish immigrants were being decimated here on the frontier, the British military did very little to help. Neither did the pacifist Quaker government of Pennsylvania. The tough settlers decided to take things into their own hands. They built private forts. By fortifying existing buildings, the Scotch-Irish men then organized themselves into militias to defend their community with their own money, guns, and powder. One such private fortification was Fort Shirley in modern-day Shirleysburg, Pennsylvania, where I'm at today. Originally George Croghan's Indian trading post, Croghan fortified it 2 months after Braddock's defeat. Other examples of these private forts were Fort Chambers, Fort McDowell, and Fort McCord, which I've covered before in one of my videos. Dr. Mercer joined his local community by volunteering in the local militia for defense. As complaints rose to the Quaker government of Pennsylvania of the intolerable situation here on the frontier, they reluctantly agreed to raise a provincial force to provide defense and create a string of government-sponsored forts to replace the private ones. Fort Shirley here was chosen to become a provincial fort. Dr. Mercer, while serving at Fort McDowell, received a commission as a captain in Pennsylvania's militia on March 6, 1756. His first duty was serving as commander here at Fort Shirley. The problem was Captain Mercer's garrison was understaffed and underfunded, leaving him to pay personally some expenditures. Happily, however, Mercer was joined by John Scott, Mercer's apprentice in the field of medicine, as Scott took a commission of being Mercer's second lieutenant. As Mercer was requesting more men and more money for the defense of the frontier, a sister fort called Fort Greenville was attacked by the Indians and defeated, killing Lieutenant Edward Armstrong, who commanded the fort during the attack. Many of these Indian incursions were commanded by Shingus and Captain Jacobs, 2 Lenni Lenape war chiefs that were staging their war parties at the Indian village called Kittanning in modern-day Kittanning, Pennsylvania. It was planned that the Pennsylvania militia would retaliate by attacking Kittanning. This operation was planned by Lieutenant Colonel John Armstrong, the brother of the slain Armstrong from Fort Greenville. The plan was to take a force of 300 men gathered here at Fort Shirley and march them north to the village of Kittanning, following the guidance of an Indian captive that was forcibly taken to Kittanning and who escaped back to the settlements. Eventually, this force, by cover of night and the lack of moonlight, would sneak close to the village and assault it, bringing the war to the doorsteps of the Native Americans. And to command one of these companies in this force, Captain Mercer willingly took on the job. Under cover of darkness, the Pennsylvania militia approached the Indian village of Kittanning. Moonlight aided their trek up until they arrived closer to the village, when the moon finally lowered in the sky to conceal their arrival. This was a brilliant, planned tactic by Colonel John Armstrong. As the force closed in on the camp at daybreak on September the 8th, 1756, the fighting commenced in the cornfields, pushing the Indians back into the town of 30 houses as they attempted to defend their village and their home. Mercer's group was in the heart of the fighting, assaulting the house of Captain Jacobs, the well-known native war chief that caused the deaths of so many on the frontier. Captain Jacobs was shot in the attack and killed as he tried to escape his burning home, since the militia had set it on fire to draw him out. Soon, from the fire, the house exploded. It was full of gunpowder, as the natives planned to leave that day in a war party to assault Mercer's Fort Shirley, something they would never get to do thanks to the surprise attack by this provincial force. Unfortunately, the blast ended up killing several members of Captain Jacobs' family. In the fighting, Captain Mercer received a broken arm from a musket ball. His second lieutenant and physician apprentice, John Scott, dressed it for Mercer as Mercer retired to a nearby hill away from the battle zones. With Indian reinforcements arriving from across the Allegheny River, the Pennsylvania men retreated from the battle site and back into the forest in a rather confused fashion. Some of Mercer's men convinced him, since he was wounded, to take a shorter route down a different trail, and so they were separated from the main force. Mercer's little group was attacked by an Indian war party who was responding to the explosions heard from what was left of their village at Kittanning. To Mercer's horror, his apprentice, John Scott, was killed in this attack. Mercer and two of his men escaped on Mercer's horse after realizing that they had lost the skirmish. Stopping to adjust Mercer's bandage, his two companions bolted on his horse to escape approaching Indians, leaving Captain Mercer to fend for himself. He hid in overgrown weeds to conceal himself from his potential attackers. Alone, and with no help coming, the wounded Dr. Mercer slowly crept his way through enemy territory, surviving on wild edibles and berries as he went. Growing weaker, the doctor would clean and dress his wound, scavenge for food to keep his strength, and keep an ever-watching eye on his surroundings, watching for approaching Indians. To cure his hunger, he killed and ate a rattlesnake raw at one point on his journey. He also survived on some freshwater clams as well. Weakened from his trek, he was discovered by friendly Cherokee Indian scouts who were working for the British at the time, and they conveyed the wounded Captain Mercer back to Fort Shirley for further aid. He was lost in the wilderness for a total of 10 whole days. Mercer eventually traveled to Lancaster for further medical treatment. As the story of his remarkable survival spread, Colonel John Armstrong gave Mercer command of Fort Morris here in Shippensburg, Pennsylvania. And actually the sign behind me here marks the location, though I think it wasn't actually here on the main drag here. I think it might have been about 2 roads over, more on Bird Street. But as the war waned in his community due to the successes at Kittanning, Mercer remained at Fort Morris here until the British decided to take another stab at assaulting Fort Duquesne in 1758 under the command of General John Forbes. On July 4, 1758, General John Forbes established his headquarters at Carlisle, Pennsylvania, to build up his force to assault Fort Duquesne at the forks of the Ohio River, in modern-day Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania today. Forbes's force was made up of 1,200 British regular troops and 2,200 Pennsylvanian troops. The Pennsylvanian troops were split in 3 battalions, the first being commanded by Colonel John Armstrong, and the third being commanded by now Colonel Hugh Mercer. This force began moving west, and in September met up with soldiers from Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina in modern-day Bedford, Pennsylvania. The Virginia troops were commanded by Colonel George Washington. It was at Bedford that Hugh Mercer and Washington met for the first time. They quickly became good friends and continued to grow their friendship during this military operation. The force, numbering over 6,000 men, began trekking across the Pennsylvania wilderness to take Fort Duquesne. For more information on this operation, please watch my video called The History of War at Fort Loudon. Due to the approaching large British and provincial force under General Forbes, the French and Indians abandoned Fort Duquesne and burned it so it could not be captured and utilized by the British Army. The force arrived at the ruined fort on November the 24th, 1758, and Colonel John Armstrong raised the flag over the fallen fort due to General Forbes being very ill. Colonel Hugh Mercer was put in charge of the fallen Fort Duquesne with the order to oversee its rebuild so the British could maintain the strategic location of the fort on the forks of the Ohio River. General Forbes named the new British fort Fort Pitt and put Hugh Mercer in command of that fort. This is, again, modern-day Pittsburgh today and how Pittsburgh got their name. And the old fort of Fort Duquesne is where you get the name Duquesne for the Duquesne University. Mercer participated in operations to throw the French out of western Pennsylvania from his post at Fort Pitt until early 1760, which found Hugh Mercer the commander of Fort Augusta in modern-day Sunbury, Pennsylvania today. He later participated in a provincial force campaign to take Presque Isle in modern-day Erie, Pennsylvania. As the war waned down in Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania Quaker government decided in the fall of 1760 to disband the Pennsylvania Provincial Military. And on January the 15th, 1761, Hugh Mercer was mustered out of service of the province and was now considered a civilian. Irritated at Pennsylvania's lack of defense of its people in the past, and now their disbanding of its military forces, Hugh Mercer foresaw how unprotected his home would become. Mercer was unmarried, and he wished to change that and raise a family, like any man would. He needed a home that was safe for his future family, and the unprotected frontier wasn't it. He sought a new home. And his good friend, George Washington, happened to suggest Fredericksburg, Virginia, Washington's boyhood home. Apparently it was a good place to raise kids. Virginia, with its well-established militia, protected its own, and Mercer was convinced. In 1761, Hugh Mercer moved to Fredericksburg, Virginia. He wrote his good friend, Colonel Henry Bouquet, to tell him that he was well and that he was determined upon applying himself to the practice of medicine in Fredericksburg, which, in his words, was worthy of a few months' trial. While there, he met Isabella Gordon and many members of the aristocracy in the growing river town. Mercer's medical practice grew rapidly, and he married Isabella, starting a family as his business and his influence grew among the wealthy of the town. As Mercer's family grew, he was frequently visited by his good friend, George Washington, who traveled from his farm at Mount Vernon to Virginia's capital of Williamsburg, as Washington was a major political figure at the time. Washington also visited his mother there in Fredericksburg at nearby Ferry Farm, which was Washington's boyhood home. Dr. Mercer and his business partner opened an apothecary shop to sell medicines and drugs in Fredericksburg in 1771. The apothecary shop is still located today on Caroline Street, Fredericksburg. Of Dr. Mercer's patients, one was George Washington's mother, Mary, who Washington moved to town due to her health, and so she was not so isolated and alone on the farm. Washington eventually sold Ferry Farm to Dr. Hugh Mercer. As America started turning towards rebellion, Mercer surrounded himself with many men of Virginia that were anti-British and becoming pro-independence. George Wheaton, John Paul Jones, George Washington, and Patrick Henry, to just name a few. As tension grew between America and Britain, Mercer found himself once again, since the Jacobite Rebellion, on the opposite side of the British Empire. Virginia created 3 regiments to defend Virginia in the coming war. Mercer was commissioned as a colonel of the 3rd. Colonel Mercer wrote sometime around this period, "We are not engaged in a war of ambition. Every man should be content to serve in that station in which he can be most useful. For my part, I have but one object in view, and that is the success of the cause." As Washington was made Commander-in-Chief of the American forces in this war, Colonel Hugh Mercer was busy defending Virginia from arriving enemy ships to the many ports of the colony. In April 1776, Washington moved his army to New York and found a gap located in New Jersey. If the British landed in New Jersey, they could cut off Washington's army and threaten the de facto capital of the United American Colonies, which at the time was Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Washington addressed the Congressional Committee in Philadelphia to suggest the formation of a flying camp or a mobile reserve army to defend the shores of New Jersey to protect from invasion. This flying camp would consist of 10,000 militiamen from Pennsylvania, Maryland, Delaware, and New Jersey, and be commanded by a brigadier general. He suggested his good friend, Hugh Mercer, to become that general. On June 14th, 1776, Mercer received a letter from John Hancock, the President of the Continental Congress. It read, "I am directed by Congress to inform you that they yesterday appointed you a brigadier general in the armies of the United Colonies, and that they request you will immediately upon receipt hereon set out for headquarters at New York." Hugh Mercer said goodbye to his family and did just that, for the success of the cause. On July 3rd, the British landed in New York on Staten Island. Washington had to figure out how to defend Manhattan. Due to blunders by Washington's generals, Washington had to evacuate New York, slipping between the fingers of his British foes, but losing many men as prisoners of war after they were captured by the British. Mercer was on the New Jersey side of the Hudson and was not involved in these fiascos, but sat in reserve with a force that was a far cry from the 10,000 men that he was supposed to maintain. Even Mercer was short-staffed. By December 1776, the Patriot cause was in jeopardy. In the bitter cold winter, the defeated Washington set up winter quarters in Pennsylvania with less than 4,000 effective fighting men. Due to their many losses by death, imprisonment, and desertion, morale was very low, and many of the militiamen they had left were due to leave the service of the fledgling country at the end of the year because their military term would expire. Food and ammo were scarce, and they wore tattered clothing. Famously, Washington's troops' feet would stain the snow red with blood as they walked because of the lack of good, sturdy shoes. They needed a win, and they needed it fast. Washington was debating an offensive strike against the British in New Jersey to catch them off guard, so to protect the American capital of Philadelphia, which was coming in range of the British forces. While at camp in Pennsylvania, Washington called his generals in for a council of war. Mercer attended, bringing with him his aide-de-camp, Major John Armstrong, Jr., the son of Mercer's former commanding officer during his years in the Pennsylvania Militia. According to Major John Armstrong, Jr., Mercer was in full agreement of an offensive operation, and he made the suggestion of a surprise attack similar to the one on Kittanning that he was involved with years before with Armstrong's father. This attack had to occur at night. It had to occur when the enemy least expected it, and it had to be swift. Last of all, it had to occur before the end of the year, so the Continental Army had enough experienced men conscripted to even try to pull it off. The decision was made to strike the Hessian force located in Trenton, New Jersey, on the early morning of December the 26th, 1776, after crossing the Delaware River on Christmas night to avoid detection, and while the Hessians were making rather merry for the celebration of Christmas. Everything went haywire. Washington's plan was to have his force cross the Delaware River at 3 different locations, but the cold weather and a nor'easter storm allowed only 1 location to be used. The seamen running the oars were dodging ice in the river and were being blown all about by high winds. Luckily, Washington's force of 2,400 men and supplies, including Mercer's brigade, which was less than 1,000 men, made it across, but a whole 3 hours later than Washington originally planned. To add to the issues, a forward scouting force alerted a group of Hessians the night before he crossed, possibly alerting them to the main force. Washington wasn't sure. With this, the delays, and the weather that was freezing his fighting men, Washington was about to just call the whole thing off. One positive aspect of Washington was he often refused to give up. Despite the issues he faced, Washington decided to press on, easily surprising the Hessian outguard, which was a welcome news to the colonials. The Hessians, who were outnumbered, retreated to the town of Trenton, New Jersey. With Washington's chief of artillery, Colonel Henry Knox, placed on the high ground facing down the streets of the town of Trenton, Mercer's brigade kicked doors down and stormed buildings to remove Hessian snipers from those buildings. Mercer's riflemen took position here in these places and laid fire on the Hessian troops on the streets, forcing them to retreat to a field south of the town. Surrounded outside of town, the Hessian forces had to surrender, resulting in the Americans capturing 948 enemy soldiers. The battle resulted in 35 Hessians killed and 60 wounded. The American losses, however, were only 4 wounded in the battle and 2 deaths of men who froze to death on the march to Trenton in the cold, harsh winter. The surprise attack worked, and America now had a reason to fight. After hearing of the devastating defeat at Trenton, British General Charles Cornwallis, who was due to set sail for England on leave, was tasked to eliminate Washington's army. Cornwallis arrived in Princeton, New Jersey on January the 1st, 1777, to assume command of British-occupied New Jersey. He brought roughly 8,000 British troops who he planned to overwhelm Washington with. On January the 2nd, Lord Cornwallis marched his force 10 miles from Princeton to Trenton, leaving roughly 1,500 men behind at Princeton as a reserve. He hoped to engage Washington that day, but it was delayed by Washington's riflemen that harassed his advancing column and slowed Lord Cornwallis down. Cornwallis arrived later that day at Trenton and easily forced the colonials out of the town and onto a defensive position south of town, which was across a swampy river that was made worse by the sudden increase in temperature that thawed the ground. So it was just a muddy, awful mess. Cornwallis's men tried to cross the bridge there across that river to assault Washington's forces on the other side, but gave up after he was repelled 3 times. As night fell, Lord Cornwallis called off his attack, in which he said, "We've got the old fox safe now. We'll go over and bag 'em in the morning." But Washington had no intentions to be bagged, and neither did Mercer. With nearly half of the men re-enlisting at the beginning of the year 1777 due to a morale boost, the Continental Army maintained many experienced troops after the successful battle at Trenton. With that in mind, General Hugh Mercer became a proponent of once again moving at night and attacking the weakly defended British stronghold at Princeton, and Washington agreed with it. Following a local woman, Washington moved his troops at night, leaving a small group behind to feed campfires and dig fake trenches to trick the British into thinking that the main force was still on the other side of that swampy river. Mercer's men were the front guard of the troop movement and was helped by the weather suddenly turning cold again and freezing the roads to make it easier to pass with horse and wagons, something that would have been detrimental to them if they stayed at the swampy river. At dawn, January the 3rd, 1777, Mercer's men spotted Cornwallis's reinforcements marching south to Trenton, but this force also spotted Mercer's men as the vanguard of Washington's army. They turned around and Mercer engaged this force to prevent them from returning to Princeton and digging into the town before his friend, Washington, arrived with his main force. After 3 volleys of musket fire, the British ordered a bayonet charge. Mercer's men mostly carried American rifles. These rifles, though way more accurate than the standard British musket, was very slow to load, and they also were not equipped with bayonets, a clear disadvantage when the enemy rushes you with a bayonet charge. The charge by the large British force outnumbered Mercer's vanguard and scared the Continental soldiers to the point that they began to waver. Mercer, whose horse was shot out from under him, stood upon the ground with his saber and called and rallied his men to stand and fight, knowing he had to hold the British at this location until the arrival of Washington with reinforcements. As the British smashed into Mercer's men, Mercer received a rifle butt in the head. He slashed with his saber, but was suddenly surrounded by British redcoats as his men retreated. Believing they captured Washington himself, the redcoats demanded of Mercer, "Call for quarters, you damned rebel." Mercer defiantly replied, "I am no rebel." He raised his saber and began slashing at his attackers. The soldiers knocked Mercer down and clubbed him and stabbed him with their bayonets. As Mercer stumbled about trying to gain his footing with 7 bayonet wounds in his body, Washington arrived on the field riding a white horse. The fighting was so fierce and Washington was so exposed that his aide, Colonel Edward Fitzgerald, pulled his hat over his face because he did not wish to see his general killed, exposing himself to great peril. With the enemy advancing, Washington rallied his and Mercer's men and forced back the redcoats, broke their line, and forced them from the field, defeating them in the 3rd victory that he had in 10 days' time. Despite Mercer's many wounds, Washington came out of the battle unscathed. It is said that Mercer watched it all while propped against an oak tree, dying. The oak tree, called the Mercer Oak, still stood until the year 2000, when a storm brought it down. Soon, John Armstrong Jr., Mercer's aide-de-camp, conveyed the seriously wounded General Hugh Mercer from the field and to the Thomas Clark House. Washington, knowing Cornwallis was coming for his force at Princeton, retreated to safer grounds, believing that his good friend, Hugh Mercer, was dead. Washington did not find out that Mercer was still alive until he was halfway to his destination, in which he sent a correspondence to General Cornwallis asking for Mercer to be given all possible attention as he was now dying in enemy-occupied territory. Cornwallis, being an English gentleman of war, provided his staff surgeon to care for the wounded general. Though the British surgeon was optimistic, Mercer knew better. Of all his bayonet wounds, Mercer was most concerned about the small one under his arm. Just like what he saw in the fields of Culloden so long ago, the small incision caused by a bayonet under the arm would be the hardest to treat due to the cut artery located there. The blood that poured from his body soaked into the floorboards of the house, which the stains, according to an 1897 report, was still visible over 100 years later. He lay dying for 9 days, eventually being tended by Dr. Benjamin Rush, a famous founding father. He finally succumbed to his wounds January the 12th, 1777, just 4 days shy of his 51st birthday. His friend Washington would never get to say goodbye. General Hugh Mercer was buried in Philadelphia with military honor. A celebrated man of his time, Mercer would be honored by townships, counties, roads, and even towns being named for him. One of these towns being Mercersburg, Pennsylvania, which was renamed in his honor by the town's creator, William Smith Jr. This town, when Mercer lived in this community, was known as Black's Trading Post in Squire Smith's town, and yet they still remember this hero when he was a practicing doctor on the frontier and a militia defender. Another legacy that he left was his influential family. His ancestors became statesmen, songwriters, and yes, influential military men. Hugh Mercer is the third great-grandfather of World War II General George S. Patton, who bragged about having family who fought courageously in the American Revolution. But the legacy that was most important is what he left for his adopted country. Washington, when he heard of Mercer's death, wrote Congress to say his successes at Princeton is counterbalanced by the loss of the brave and worthy General Mercer. Though General Mercer's career was extraordinary, the Scottish rebel, frontier doctor, militia commander, and brigadier general in the American Revolution could have gone on to become statesman, congressman, founding father, and maybe even President of the United States of America. Major James Wilkinson, a Revolutionary soldier, wrote, "In General Mercer, we lost a chief who for education, experience, talents, disposition, integrity, and patriotism was second to no man but the commander-in-chief and was qualified to fill the highest trusts of the country." The extraordinary Hugh Mercer, if it wasn't for his untimely death, could have been a great asset to the future of the United States. But it wasn't meant to be. George Washington always said that great providence protected him as if God wanted him to survive. A fact illustrated in his rally at Princeton after Mercer's small vanguard was overwhelmed. Hugh Mercer did not have that same providence. But it was Hugh Mercer, despite his death, who was pivotal in turning the dark days of the Patriot cause to 3 victories that cemented their spirit to press on. This hero is truly unsung and forgotten, but maybe that is what he always wanted all along. As he wrote during the time of the Revolution, "We are not engaged in a war of ambition. Every man should be content to serve in that station in which he can be most useful. For my part, I have but one object in view, and that is the success of the cause." Thank you for watching. Please see my sources in the description below. If you wish to see more, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you again. And again, this is a dream come true to be able to do some of this. So just want to thank you and allowing me to tell you these stories. But remember, these stories are ours, and it is our duty to keep these stories alive. See you next time as I explore what in history.